Thank you. At this time, we'd like to call to order the Palo Alto City Council Rail Committee meeting for Wednesday, August 23rd, 2023. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Vinker.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing. Absent.
Okay. Well, before we wade into our full agenda, we have an opportunity for members of the public to speak on items that are not otherwise on the agenda. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak?
Yes, we have one member of the public, Eric Nordman.
And Eric, I just want to make sure you know that we do have on item 2, we're going to be discussing Churchill and Charleston East Meadow, but if it's not directly related to kind of the geotechnical, you're certainly welcome to speak more broadly.
Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Nordman, and I would like to talk about 2 items that need clarification. The first item is the level of service, or LOS, delay time, which is used in the traffic studies. The LOS delay time is different from the actual travel time. If the distance between, it is the difference between the high travel time and the low travel time, low volume travel times. This leads to an unfair comparison between alternates when some turning motions are not allowed. For example, for the Charleston Underpass option, drivers wanting to go west from Alma must first go east, go around the roundabout, and then finally go west. Similarly, for East Meadow, drivers wanting to go west go on an excursion through the neighborhood streets. This extra time is always present, but is not included in the LOS delay time. Luckily, a simple solution exists. Hexagon said that it would only take a few hours to calculate the average travel time, but in order for this information to be available, the Rail Committee needs to ask staff to determine the actual travel time. Another item is property acquisitions. Multiple people, including a council member, have not realized how many properties need to be acquired for the underpass option. It requires at least 4 houses, 1 14-unit apartment building, and partial acquisitions from over 30 properties. I suggest the Rail Committee ask staff to generate a simple table or spreadsheet listing the properties and whether they're full or partial acquisitions, and update it as changes are made. An important decision needs to be made by the Rail Committee before April 1st, 2024. And it would be a shame if that decision was not fully informed. Please request this information from staff. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to note that Councilmember Lowing has joined us. So we will now proceed to verbal updates on any interagency activities.
Sorry, Chair Burt, we have one more request to speak.
I missed that. We have a second public speaker, Adrian Brandt. Welcome.
Perfect. And Adrian, you can speak whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mayor Burt. I'm a member of the Caltrain Citizens Advisory Committee, and I made the following comment there as well to our staff. And it regards the new 3-digit national suicide hotline number. Palo Alto, I know, has interest in, has issues in the past with suicides and concern around that topic. And what I did suggest, based on media reports and some podcasts I had heard, is that the new 3-digit suicide hotline is resulting in a doubling of the number of contacts made, outreach from people that are in crisis to the assistance centers. And the thinking is that it's much easier and less threatening to text and easier to remember the number than the 7-digit, or actually it's a 10-digit number, area code and 7 digits, that is on all the suicide prevention signs up and down the right of way through Palo Alto and the rest of the Caltrain line. So I would suggest that Palo Alto and the Caltrain staff work to update the signage to take advantage of that new 3-digit, easier to remember and less, just easier to engage with, because it does support texting. And from what I've heard, the belief is that people are more likely to avail themselves of the number just because it's so much easier. So that's 988. And that was the suggestion I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. On that note, we will now proceed to verbal updates on interagency activities. And I think it's really our staff who's going to provide any of those updates on Caltrain, VTA, or other city staff activities.
Thank you very much. Philip Kemi, Chief Transportation Official. First, just to speak on Caltrain electrification, the final phase of electrification is currently in progress, and they are testing the new train set, and the electrified revenue service is expected to begin in fall of 2024. And there is an electric train tour coming up on September 23rd from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the San Francisco station. So if you want to go see one of the new electric trains, which are really cool looking, that's an opportunity. Regarding the Caltrain corridor study, Caltrain staff have been providing updates on that. City and county staff had a meeting on the 17th, and really they kind of went over some of the different examples of different types of alternatives that can be discussed and some of the decision-making process that have occurred. And specifically, they went over a case study for Redwood City and talked about their decision-making process. They'll also be giving that same presentation at LPMG, the local policymakers group meeting, which is on the 24th. What is that? Tomorrow, 5:30 to 7:30, and then likely at the council meeting, which I believe is, board meeting, which I believe is September 7th. And then finally, there's a VTA ad hoc meeting on September 29th from 10 to noon, currently scheduled. Regarding the San Francisco Creek emergency repairs, we just had ongoing coordination. Council approved on June 19th the MOU to work with Caltrain and the scope of work associated with within the city's right-of-way, also in coordination with Menlo Park regarding the pedestrian and bicycle bridge. Continuing to coordinate with Caltrain staff, Public Works, our Public Works department, and Menlo Park. And the plans are currently at 100% design, and the estimated total project cost is $5.5 million. And Caltrain has hired the contractor to perform the restoration work, and that work's going to begin in the next 2 to 4 weeks, so very soon. And then the final update, I would provide a really in-depth update on all the grant stuff that we've had going on, as we've had a lot, but that will fall under the next item. So happy to turn it over for questions.
So, Director, it sounds like you've actually seen the electric trains down there. Or...
Yeah, actually, I've only seen them in photos now, so I'm excited to see them in person.
Okay. And did I understand you to say that service is expected in September of 2024?
Fall. Yeah.
Fall, but 2024.
Yes,
okay.
Fall of 2024.
Thank you.
I'll just add that I got to attend the train exposition down at San Jose a few weeks ago. There were something like 5,000 people who showed up to see these new trains. It was really remarkable. And they are, I would say that the cars themselves are going to be an additional inducement to ride because it's sort of like you're getting business class ride there. It's Wi-Fi, they're new, they're comfortable, they're well designed. And so probably for at least the first decade of their use, they're going to be pretty jazzy. Caltrain is just absolutely determined to hit this fall 2024 deadline. They had a number of delays over the recent years, and the management and the contractor are extremely committed to staying on that deadline to the point where the Caltrain board had received a direct report from the international CEO of Balfour Beatty, which is a very big company, and this for the last year or so has had the attention all the way up to top management, and kind of a redirection of focus and the resources needed to get the job done and on time and done safely, because that was an additional part of the challenges they've had the last few years. I'll add on that last dimension, Caltrain about 9 months ago added for the first time ever a chief safety officer, Mike Meter. And so they now have someone who is an expert in safety. That's not only safety within on construction and operation of the line internally, but externally, safety of the track system. And that lastly brings up something I've started to bring up to the Caltrain board and intend to bring forward in kind of a more systematic way, which is, over the decades, Caltrain has at different times had safety issues, people cutting across the tracks, inadvertent crashes of cars at grade crossings, and intentional suicide on the tracks. And the response has been kind of addressing those hot spots of different sorts over time in a limited way, with a notion that ultimately full grade separation would be is the only way to have really near complete security and safety. But shy of that, we have ongoing challenges, and in the last year or so, an increase of corridor-wide incidents, and some of them tragic. And I think that Caltrain needs to actually re-examine their previous approach and look at a system-wide corridor safety approach independent of the grade separations. Because if and when the corridor is fully grade separated, it's looking to be, a 20-year period from now. And so just to let you know, that's an issue. Now, in case anybody doesn't know, Congress women Spear and Eshoo got a $800,000 grant, is that correct, for fencing in Palo Alto. Caltrain doesn't have the money in hand yet, but we're beginning the process already of identifying the prioritized locations, so that we're close to ready to go once the funds are actually received. And that's a big deal. And we're very grateful that they did this focusing on Palo Alto's issues. But as we've all seen in the news, we're seeing a lot more incidents throughout the corridor, and it's really a serious problem. When we have a fatality like that, it really affects the employees. It's traumatic. It affects the people who are on the train from a trauma standpoint, not to mention it also disrupts the system, which is a lesser issue, but still an issue. And more broadly, it affects people who might ride the train. It's a pretty traumatic experience. And so there are a lot of reasons that I don't think we've stepped back and realized as we're trying to rebuild ridership, how much of a threat to really how people feel about Caltrain, including the employees, this security issue is. So we'll see what happens. The solution won't happen overnight, but I think it's overdue to go down that path. All right. Yeah, Philip.
Thanks for providing all that additional context. One more selling point for the Caltrain I just want to note is these new electrified trains will be the first in the nation of the bi-level, it's called dual electric, I believe, but it's battery equipped electric EMUs. So we'll be the first in the nation of these types of trains. So definitely will be unique. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So we're now ready to go on to item number 1 among action items, which is review and discussion of new grants and requirements from the Federal Rail Administration, the FRA, and the California State Transportation Agency for grade separation projects, and then to direct staff to develop funding agreements. Mr. Kami?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start talking if we can get the PowerPoint up. But this item is meant to provide an update on our all of the recent grant activity, but also just kind of funding the big picture and to talk about the process right now. We're seeking direction on this item, and the reason that we're seeking direction on this item is because and the direction is to really develop the funding agreements. The reason we're asking for this is because these grants are going to come with obligations. There's no such thing as free money, right? So most importantly to our discussion today will be the timeline and syncing all of the different various tasks that we have in process. Can I get the next slide? These are just the funding sources. Provides just an overview of all the various agencies. And now we have funding from all these. So we have local funding, regional funding, state funding, and federal funding. Next slide. So we've been providing updates on this at various meetings, but staff have been working really hard. Your staff that you see here today on applying for nearly every pot of funding that's come across us that we think we can possibly compete for. And the fruits of that labor have really been shown in the two recent awards that we've been notified. In June, we were notified that we received the Federal Rail Administration's $6 million in grant funding for their rail crossing elimination program. That is for Churchill, Charleston, and Meadow preliminary engineering and environmental phase. And that's our federal funding that we've recently received. And then following that, last month in July, the California State Transportation Agency announced that we're going to be receiving $23.79 million for our final design phase, only for Churchill Avenue, not for Charleston Meadow. And then lastly, just to make sure we've covered everything, we're applying again for federal grants with the U.S. Department of Transportation. We just submitted our application actually a week ago. Monday. That's right, Monday. We just submitted our application for both Mega and Infra, and we applied for final design phase for Meadow Drive and Charleston Road. And next slide, please. So this slide, just to note, this was the original timeline that was submitted back in 2022. This was a while back. And we didn't anticipate that it would take so long to get notice from the feds that, about this. And actually, we kind of decided that we probably weren't getting awarded because it took so long for us to get notified. But because of that, our timelines have really changed. And quite frankly, the timeline that you see there before you shows us starting this project in July of 2023, starting, I should say, the preliminary engineering environmental phase in July of 2023, which is last month. Not possible because we don't even have the grant agreement done yet with them. So all of our timelines are going to have to shift, but we've been having discussions with the FRA, and they're going to be amenable to adjusting the timelines, recognizing that not only did they take time to get us this grant award, but also that a lot has changed for us in the past, over a year that since we applied for this, including the current, well, I should say, including the additional studies that we've been working on, and you'll receive one of those today, and also the Caltrain participation, specifically the Caltrain service agreement and the Caltrain request that they be the lead implementing agency. So they would plan to lead the preliminary engineering and environmental documentation phase with our collaboration. And then the next one that you see is the final design phase, which is the separate funding request, which is the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. That's the Cal-STA program. And that, of course, we set that one to follow the preliminary engineering and environmental phase, which is how you would typically do this. But we have not yet met with the program managers there to discuss how we would shift it based on, what we agree to with the FRA for the rail crossing elimination program. So that's our submitted timeline. But if we can just skip on to the next slide. So this shows how the current rail crossing elimination program, you note that it says proposed timeline. That's what we've been discussing with both the FRA program manager and also Caltrain staff in order to actually deliver the PE and environmental phase. So this is shifting the program over a bit. It's initiating that phase of work in the second quarter of 2024. So really starting in probably sometime in April, kind of starting with the project. So it does shift it over from what do we have, July previously. And then you'll see below that we have the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program, but we don't have that one shifted yet. That's still our submitted program. So they don't quite line up yet now, but we're hoping that they'll be amenable to shifting that a year based on, the fact that we need to complete the PE and environmental phase before we can move to final design. Next slide, please. So this is, I think, probably the key, and just noting that your attachment A has this and a little more details. So if you want, you can compare this to the timeline that we discussed. But this is kind of everything, well, maybe not everything, but most of the things that we have going on right now that really influence our timeline. And so if we work through this, we've got first the geotechnical study that you'll be receiving report on today. We have the underpass refinements that have already been completed. We have the Caltrain review, the service agreement. And this is one where you'll see that, originally they had proposed that they'd completed in the second quarter of 2024. I'll come back to that one after we finish through everything. The additional studies needed, and this is really additional studies that are potentially identified following the council criteria update. So this would be additional traffic studies, look at sea level rise, sustainability, maintenance, those type of things. And just noting that we don't have a contract for this right now. So it would be a new procurement, a new contract, and it would take time to complete all of these. And then we have, the next item is the Caltrain corridor strategy study, which it does say September 2023 now, but I think they're saying October maybe now. But I think for this and the entirety of the other design elements that are also in that Caltrain corridor study, I think we can kind of anticipate sometime in winter, between September and December, we're likely to have that information. But the challenge here is the last one, which is that in order for us to move into that PE and environmental phase, we really need to have LPA selection to occur at the council or by the council in order to start that. And so that needs to happen before we can start the PE and environmental phase, which is scheduled to start currently in April. So we have two items that would kind of overlap with that. And so therein lies the problems. And that's kind of just the things that we need to discuss as we think about moving forward with these grants. And of course, if we don't accept the first grant or we don't move forward with the first grant, we have issues with the second grant too. So these are kind of, they can't act. Well, I guess the first one can act independent of the second one, but the second one can't really act independent of the first one. Regarding the first item that we have that overlaps a bit, the Caltrain review, they're doing an initial review right now of a kind of like a high level review to identify if there's any serious issues that they believe, and they will have that in next 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah, so we should know sometime in either late September or early October if there are things that we should really be concerned about, maybe any of the alternatives where they say this is never going to work, or something happens that is a major red flag. So on that regard, I think probably the Caltrain review, we likely can figure out how to fit within this timeline. It's the second one, the additional studies that will be needed, and really just kind of like to have a discussion today about how we could potentially get to council preferred alternatives in order to meet the grant deadlines. So with that, I don't really have much more to present, but just I guess open to questions or happy to open the floor to comments.
Thank you. Colleagues? Ed?
Sure. Thank you. Sorry for being a minute late. I had another meeting in the building. You know how those things go. A lot of my questions were on the last two things that you just, one of the things I said is please explain the Caltrain review. So you've sort of just done that and you think they're going to try to compress it into 6 to 8 weeks.
Well, no. So actually, they're not going to compress it into 6 to 8 weeks.
Oh.
They're going to give us an initial review during that 6 to 8 weeks where we can find out, and really maybe that'll help us to figure out what the timeline will be and whether they can do it or whether there's going to be things that are going to potentially linger and be issues. Like as an example, they might look at one of the alternatives and they might say, this is going to take us longer to resolve the issues on this. It might, and so there's potential that they might tell us one of the alternatives they're not going to be able to figure out before April 1. That is, I just want to set that up as a potential issue that could come up. I don't anticipate. I think what they'll tell us is that either they're going to be able to review all the items before we need to have a final decision, or they're not.
So they're the complete driver of this. We can influence and ask for help and acceleration, but we're really dependent on them for this.
Well, sort of, yeah. I will in some regard, yes, but also note that they're going to have to take leadership of this in order for the April 1st phase. So there could be some bleed over with that, but the challenge is, I guess, Rail Committee Council making a choice potentially with, however much information we have from Caltrain at that time, I would say.
Okay, and then the second bar, obviously we would like to get that bar shorter, right? The additional studies. But
yeah.
you've done your best estimates here and say it's going to go through 24. I'm just wondering what the shortcuts are. When you mentioned, for example, sea level rise, which of course has to be looked at, but is it possible that sea level rise could nix an alternative at one of the crossings? Could that be that fatal?
I think that, I guess that's a question. Well, I think that's a question that I'd put back on people that will make the decision for this, because I'm not sure. So another
way to ask the questions: are we going to find things that need mitigating, and we think we can mitigate them, or are we things that are going to be fatal?
Yeah, and I think to answer that question, things that would be fatal would be typically identified in that environmental and PE phase. So some of these things would typically be identified during that phase. And I guess I'll also say that we could also continue to move forward with these additional studies during that phase. But the challenge is having that information beforehand for council and rail committee to make decisions. And I'm just realistically, I don't think that we will be able to complete all of those additional studies beforehand. Just noting that we'll need an entirely new procurement for that.
If I might, on just your question on sea level rise, which is just one of several things, but we'll get into that probably a little bit more under the geotechnical. But hypothetically, and what the leading researchers really out of UC Berkeley have been looking at is that sea level rise will actually result in groundwater going closer to the surface, because the saline water will basically push it up. The non-salinated water, the fresh water, will become closer to the surface. However, we really have two issues. What's the impact of water level during construction? And then what's the impact post-construction? And during construction, I would not anticipate that we're going to experience sea level rise to a degree that it would be significant. But longer term, maybe that's something we'll have to look at, and we can talk about that more.
Okay, that's actually really helpful. Is the timeline sort of extension here based on the changes that this committee recommended in the criteria?
Yes. So that entire line, the additional studies, those are all things that came out of the update to the council criteria.
I'm still trying to figure out a way to be hopeful about getting that thing shorter. So I don't know if that means we should look at one or two that are big deals that, you know, there's some way to truncate or not, but okay. I think the other ones I did ask, one of the comments I had was, please translate what it means that they're going to be flexible, but it sounds like they're going to be very flexible in terms of the timeline, given what has and hasn't occurred. So
yeah, you mean the granting agency?
Yes.
Yeah. So I should say, I'm sorry. So I wouldn't say very flexible. I think that's not the correct term at all. So
no,
they actually have.
You said some flexibility. Yeah, I was pushing you.
Yeah, no. So they actually have a performance period for these programs. So we actually can't shift that much. And we haven't actually been able to define what that performance period is from them yet. But I mean, we might be able to shift like a year. That's kind of what we believe is within reason for them to actually deliver. And just noting also, these are funding authorization. The funding comes from funding authorization. So there's a limit to how far they can push out things. So this is kind of the point where we need to make a decision if we're going to make a decision in order to take this funding.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you for this report. This is tremendously helpful to see it all in one place and the timelines and the way you presented it, because there are so many interdependencies and moving parts and shifting timeframes that I'm sure it was a challenge to even figure out how to present it. And this was really helpful to me. So thank you. A lot of my questions were answered in your report or asked by my colleague, Councilmember Lowing, but just a couple of follow-ups. So for the current grant activities timeline, the middle box on page 8 of my packet, talks about the FRA grant of $6 million. And, you know, in the staff report, you noted that we would be also using the $14 million from Measure B for the PE&E. Just pardon my ignorance, but are there any use it or lose it issues around that? Are there any time activities and timeline implications for triggering access to that? Or is that just kind of there ready in the bank for us to use?
Yeah, sorry. And so just really quickly, just to qualify that these are, and not to answer this question, but earlier, just to mention the timelines, these are our estimated timelines right now. So I just want to make sure everyone in the public understands these are not like defined timelines. We have our submitted ones, which were the submitted ones, but these are kind of our estimates for everything.
Fair enough.
But to answer your question, are you speaking about the Measure B funds specifically? So we believe, well, we know how much money we have in the Measure B funding. It's not use it or lose it. It's dedicated to these programs. What we do need to do is we need to, and we have been coordinating with VTA on programming the funds, and also with the other cities that have been allocated these funds, to make sure that we don't need to like bond or anything like that in order to use the funds, because they're only based on, you know, what sales tax has been collected. Okay. So yeah, but to this point, this funding is already identified within the program.
Okay, and that's, I think, by triggering mechanisms, that's what I meant. You have to bond, you have to do anything so we can actually get access. All right, thank you. And then the other is just a little broader, and because you've done such a good job of explaining the current ones, that there's also this chart, the tentative future grant submission timeline. Can you give us just a little bit of a picture on that? What might be, you know, coming down the pipe, you know, how much, which crossings, which phases, just any ballparks on that?
Sorry, is this another, I'm remembering, is this an attachment?
It's in the, so in the packet on page 8, you had the two lovely charts that were in our slides, but you also had a third one below that. There was a timeline called tentative future grant submission timeline.
Yeah, sorry, I'm remembering this. I just don't have it. I'm not finding it in front of me. But to answer your question, this is, we tried to take an estimate of when we thought that the next applications would be. Thank you. Yes, that's on attachment A, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's just, yes.
Thank you. That's right. See, I knew that attachment A had a lot more things on it. Yeah. So this current grant activities timeline, this is
so below the current grant, there's a tentative future grant.
There we go. So it wasn't letting me scroll down. So these are, you see that we've recently applied for the mega infra, as I mentioned, for the final design. The future funding, well, and we will apply for this Section 190 fund. That's state funds. We anticipate we will get awarded, or I don't want to step too far, but I think it's very likely that we will get awarded that funding as well.
Section 190.
Section 190. Yeah, I don't know, Ripon, do you want to kick me and tell me I'm saying it wrong?
Yeah.
So again, Ripon Bhatia, Senior Engineer with the Office of Transportation. With regards to the Section 190, there's $15 million allocation for an annual basis statewide, and they prioritize it based on the project readiness and funding availability. Over the period of time, I think we could accommodate that $15 million in any phase of the project, because our phases are going to be like, we are anticipating that we will use that during construction likely, or during the right-of-way acquisition or utility relocation phase. So that's further down the road, but we are lining us up to make sure that we are ready and be able to access that funding when available or when needed.
That's terrific, especially if we have to move quickly. And you're saying 15, not 50, right?
15.
Okay.
Just to add on, the Section 190 has been the state grade separation funding program up until now. And it's been dwarfed by the new federal and state funds. Spreading $15 million a year on the whole state doesn't get you very far. It's not insignificant. And as Ripon said, we think we will qualify in part because of the high risk level of our grade separations. That's part of how they allocate those funds. But the new funds far exceed what we historically had available from the state.
Okay.
And then the other point to this, the other federal grants, which is so ambiguous. Sorry for that. But what that's meant to signify is our potential for applying, assuming we get funded for our final design for Charleston Meadow, but this is opportunities for us to apply for actual construction dollars, which will really become feasible once we have preferred alternatives and then we move into the PE and environmental phase. So that's really meant to identify those big chunks of funding that the current authorization bill has set aside for these types of projects. And our hope is to be able to apply for those for construction dollars.
And you said for the current authorization bill. So that's excellent.
And can you clarify, are you referring there to the same funding that is channeled through MTC that Mountain View, for instance, received the No, not that. Well, then can you speak to that funding as well?
Not necessarily, but that would also be in that other, potential future grants. I guess really what we're saying is any other funding opportunities that come along once we have a preferred alternative that we can apply for construction dollars. But it could be is that the BIL program, BIL grant, which was the one through MTC. Then there's mega infra, all of these that will be probably on an annual basis through the 5-6 years. Yeah.
Wow. So we have the problem of trying to move fast enough to get some of the grants, but make sure we sequence and can do the evaluations promptly enough. Then council decide with time for the public to comment, and then also sort of already have in the pipeline the funding for future if we actually accomplish all of that, so we're not slowed down by that. That's a big lift, but this is super helpful in understanding how it all fits together. So thank you.
And to add to that is that if you do not complete, it becomes a negative mark on your performance. And so that is also a challenge that we need to apply and get it, and then we need to perform so that we don't get blacklisted for future grants.
Yeah, so that is a key. And I mentioned earlier, like that we want to, if we take this money, if we accept this grant, we're going to have a timeline that we're obligated to keep. But not only that, it's reimbursement. These are reimbursement grants typically. So we actually need to deliver in order to get reimbursed. And if we if we get off the track or we don't deliver the project, then potentially we're on the hook for the money. So
in sum, you're saying that if we take it on and we don't deliver, it's a double whammy because 1, we didn't get it done like we wanted, and 2, it's a black mark against potential future funding. So
yes,
so we need to be judicious, aggressive but judicious as we proceed today. All right, thanks so much.
Yeah, it just keeps coming back as it did when I read through this. It just keeps coming back to that April 1, 24 deadline. So do you have recommendations on what we can do to realign these things because they're not aligned? And it seems like that's a crisis point. So it's maybe a fair point for us to start our discussion on that.
Yeah, I think, well, I'd like to give Councilmember Burt, or Chair Burt of this committee, a chance to provide his input first.
Yeah,
because for Caltrain, I think that's something that we can work on, at a staff level. But really for the other additional studies, I'm not sure how to proceed with that. I guess my answer is I don't know how we can possibly complete all those things by April 1st. So if the question is to expedite those projects, I think there's limited stuff we can do. If it's maybe to break it off and do smaller things within them, there's maybe potentially some stuff we can do, like maybe a smaller traffic study, other things like that maybe are potential ways of doing this, but also recognize that some of that work in those additional studies will be done in the following phase, but then that doesn't help to make the decision for the LPA necessarily. So,
and can you review for us? We have one of the things is to make sure that we have a lot of acronyms going around, and I was going back and forth to make sure even I was following some of the acronyms. So other council members and the public are going to have an even harder time. So if we could make sure that maybe we even set up a little glossary of acronyms, maybe that's the easiest way rather than try and track them. So LPA, the L is either the P and A is preferred alternative.
Yeah, right? It's locally preferred alternative.
Locally, okay.
Yes, or local preferred alternative.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that that's a hard deadline on that. What really drives that to be a hard deadline?
So what drives that? And you're right, that's not necessarily, this is what we're anticipating based on our negotiations with FRA, but the deadline within that is that in order to have the preliminary engineering and environmental phase start, they need to know what project they're working on. So typically what they'll do is they'll look at one alternative and they'll do that, and then the other alternative is typically no build alternative.
And then because we have a preferred alternative for Churchill, we're really needing to get to the preferred alternative for Charleston East Meadow.
Correct.
Which also, presents a dilemma for us because we got the 23.7 million for Churchill, even though we have tentatively said we really think Charleston East Meadow will be sequentially first, but we hadn't zeroed in on a preferred alternative, so we weren't eligible for those funds. So now we have more funds for the alternative that were further along on the decision-making in theory, but not the one that's first in sequence in our what we're anticipating. So one of my questions is, do we have any sense of whether the FRA would allow us to shift from funds from Churchill to Charleston East Meadow once we have a preferred alternative for Charleston East Meadow?
So that is not the FRA, that second grant. If you're talking about for final design, the final design is actually the California State Transportation Agency, CalSTA, or CalSTA. So no, I guess just to be really blunt, no, they won't, because that's the application that they accepted was for Churchill. So we won't be allowed to shift it. But that said, we did apply for final design funds for Charleston and Meadow. That's our recent application that we've submitted. I do think that if we are not awarded again for that funding, that once we have an LPA selected and we get into the environmental phase, that we'll be very likely to be competitive for an award if we again do not get funding for it.
So that answer kind of brings to me to the forefront what's going to be a difficult decision for us, because I want to give a broader context that then influences this decision making. When we and everybody up and down the corridor have looked at essentially corridor-wide grade separations, they were for a range of reasons and drivers why we were grade separating. In Palo Alto, we have priorities over track safety and security and some other factors that are in our criteria. Essentially, the criteria reflects why we're doing this. But for up and down the corridor, the highest drivers were that Caltrain was going to be adding a lot more trains. High-speed rail was prospectively coming, and there was going to be more traffic on the roads. And so between greater gate downtime and more cars that need to get across, we were looking at the risk of gridlock. We now have really fundamental changes that have happened in especially fixed rail transit throughout the region and the state. Hybrid work will be with us to some degree. I continue to think less than we currently have, but a lot more hybrid work than we had before the pandemic. And an agency like Caltrain, we're right now at about a third pre-pandemic ridership. Some of that is because the tech economy is still not fully recovered, or it's had its downturn. But a lot of it is the hybrid work. BART is about 50% ridership. At VTA, we are 85 or 90% on our buses and about 50% on light rail. So fixed rail, where you have discretionary riders, higher income riders typically, there's just not the demand there was. So then we've all, as agencies, been saying, well, when we get through this COVID, we'll get back to something normal and we'll just get our ridership back up to where we were, and then we start building. And part of that we started building was because there were projections of very significant population growth within the state and the region. And basically projecting over a 30% population growth between now and 2016. So a number of months ago, Caltrans came out with their population growth projections, and hardly anybody seemed to be paying attention. They're the agency who has the responsibility to say, we got to figure out the transportation systems for the state to accommodate the future population. And they actually projected a decline in population by 2060. The Department of Finance, which is more used for other purposes, including housing projections and otherwise, just a few weeks ago came out with their projections, and they projected flat by 2060. So instead of going from almost 40 million to almost 53 million, it stays flat. And it's a variety of factors. There's greater emigration out, less immigration in, but the biggest factor is birth rate. And we're not going to be able to, in all likelihood, have any substantial impact on just that fundamental demographic shift. So the tailwind of population growth, which was necessitating expansion of our transportation and transit systems, is not there anymore. And now we have this depreciation of our in kind of organic ridership that hybrid work is doing. One of the things that I've pushed and presented to Caltrain and VTA, and Caltrain is now initiating as part of a marketing plan, is how do we induce a mode shift? And how do we get more ridership? And I came to realize that the model is Palo Alto. And it's the programs that we have developed over 20 plus years that have very much driven why we're the second highest Caltrain ridership in the whole system, second only to San Francisco. We have far more boardings than San Jose does. And it's because a whole series of programs, the general use permit that limited net trips, the mandate to the Stanford hospitals that they buy Caltrain Go passes, our own various development agreements, and then our TMA expanded citywide, and then even our city buying Caltrain passes for all city employees. And we did those things to reduce traffic congestion in our city, to reduce parking demand, and to reduce greenhouse gases. But they also had the impact of being huge drivers to Caltrain ridership. Pre-pandemic, those things were a mixed blessing for Caltrain because Go passes were basically discounted rides, and they were at 100+% of their seats. And so we were competing with discounted rides for full fare passengers. Now that's completely changed. Caltrain, their revenue is, I forget, about half of it is now from the Go passes. And they're really re-examining their whole program on how Go passes are going to be a backbone of their future. But it all still comes back to, we have a great challenge to ever get back up to the pre-pandemic ridership. And it's not clear that we ever will. There are ways that we may be able to. We're going to have better trains, electrified, modern. We have the downtown subway connection to in San Francisco, which pre-pandemic was almost double the number of people within a mile of Caltrain for the whole system, that extension. And then we had the other pillar of the Googleplex in downtown San Jose that has largely been put on hold. That hopefully will eventually happen. It's a great transit-oriented development. The other thing that we as agencies haven't done, and by that I mean Caltrain and VTA, we haven't looked at all the transit-oriented development up and down the corridor to see what's the organic use of transit by building transit-oriented development. We all say, build it and they will come. And we haven't looked at, well, how much did they come? What portion of the office workers or residents in that transit-oriented development areas are using transit unless they're given a transit pass? And I personally think that we're going to have all the cities and agencies in the corridor are going to have to move toward people having transit passes, particularly low income, like we do with our downtown TMA, because those folks were the least transit using before our TMA came along. So it's going to take real proactive measures to even get ridership back to where it was. The reason I go into that whole spiel is because we look at, we thought we had an urgency to get our grade separations done before we had gridlock, because good luck building them once you have gridlock. That is less the case. We certainly now look like we have adequate time or more adequate time. Nobody really knows how that's all going to play out, what amount of recovery and traffic is going to occur when, but it's very unlikely that we're going to see over 6 trains an hour within a decade at Caltrain. And Caltrain actually had to, when they got federal dollars, they had to submit a service model to the feds that was based on 6 trains an hour. They're now needing to go back to the feds to negotiate a revision of that because they just don't have the demand for that. And they're not alone. This is transit agencies, are all facing similar things. And they think that the feds will be accommodating because that's part of the reality. So all that goes into, we now have a big grant for Churchill, which wasn't our highest priority. We have grade separations in North Palo Alto and none in South Palo Alto. And Churchill, as much as it has its own congestion, was determined to be less of a issue than Charleston East Meadow. So this goes to what Philip was raising as a question of, okay, not only can we move fast enough, but do we still, if we can't reprogram this Churchill dollars, does that create a dilemma for us?
And just really quickly to say, I don't anticipate that they would allow us to reprogram it to Charleston Meadow, but it is something that we'd be willing to discuss with them, noting that we haven't had our initial discussions with them about it. And we'll, similar to what we've done with FRA, we'll meet with their program manager and talk with them about not only modifying the schedule, but whether we have the opportunity to change it to Charleston and Meadow, should that be more appropriate.
And I'll reiterate what I started with, which is in Palo Alto, we not only have congestion issues, and for that matter, a desire to improve our movement at all modes across the tracks, but we also have a higher priority on track safety and security than other cities on the corridor. And that remains so, whether we have more trains or more traffic, that's still a priority for our community. But it is something that we need to, frankly, as we were going through all the criteria and prioritization, the safety and security started getting kind of pushed down in the public consciousness of why are we doing this? And now, on a relative basis, I'd say it's at a higher relative importance versus traffic and congestion than it was a couple years ago on a relative basis.
Just to provide a little additional context, when we initially applied for the final design, we were asked to prioritize our projects, and we put Charleston and Meadow as our highest priority, but we were awarded for Churchill. The reason we were awarded for Churchill is because we had selected, and this is conjecture, but my understanding is we were awarded for Churchill because of
we had a preferred
alternative.
Exactly. And I'll add one other thing. Philip talked about, or Ed was asking about Measure B. With VTA, we expect to get an update on the anticipated long-term revenue from Measure B in the next couple months, and the indication is that the dollars will be higher. This came up really because the BART extension costs continue to rise, and part of that would be addressed through even higher Measure B dollars than we had projected. But all the Measure B dollars are proportionate for the different buckets. So the bucket to grade separations, I expect, will also grow. Now, costs go up each year, so I don't know that they're growing as fast as costs are rising, but the absolute dollars are going to go up. All right, so that's a lot of context for a difficult kind of discussion on where are we going to go on here. As of right now, it seems that what we want to do is continue pedal to the metal and make as much progress as we can on moving forward both of these alternatives. But we have this question that Philip raised of, are we in any way boxing ourselves in by accepting the Churchill dollars? Is that the simple way to frame it?
No, just really any of this grant funding. So number one, just the preliminary engineering and environmental phase. The first thing, I mean, in order to move that project forward, we're going to have preferred alternatives for Charleston Meadow. So that's the first question, I think. Then the second one is regarding Churchill. I don't think that's as much of a question. I think that's just more interdependent on the first one. I think actually just getting final design done on Churchill doesn't even mean that we couldn't construct Charleston Meadow first. And actually it doesn't mean that we would get final design completed for Churchill before Charleston Meadow. So I don't think that's boxing us in. I think we want to keep moving with final design regardless. And you can have final design documents that we can't act on because of financial reasons for several years. And that will, I guess, the construction phase will determine which project goes first, right? So when we program the construction phase. So I don't think moving forward with final design for Churchill means that even if we didn't do Charleston Meadow, that doesn't mean that Churchill is ahead of Charleston and Meadow. But I think it is very possible, since we're talking about a few years away, potentially 2020, what is it, 2026 or 2025, that we would get funding to do final design for Charleston and Meadow, and potentially they would both happen or at least start at the same time.
Vicki?
Yeah, I want to make sure to clarify the context you provided so that we're all starting from the same understanding. So I hear what you say about ridership and the pandemic and those kinds of traffic trends. And it seems like we really have these two buckets of traffic and safety, right? Are two of the big drivers, just to overly generalize. And that shifted some given the things you described. What I don't, and I understand that there was a prioritization of Charleston and Meadow over Churchill. That may or may not flip now because of these things you've mentioned. What is the concern if it does at this point, given that things have changed? I mean, what is the problem if Churchill were to go forward before the other two?
I think it is a community issue, whether the community, the city provides an additional grade crossing in North Palo Alto, where we already have multiple grade separations, versus in South Palo Alto, where we have none. Along with, when we looked at the traffic studies for Churchill, we had a tough call of potentially a closure and a design where Embarcadero in theory, which I was always a little uncomfortable with this conclusion, could be redesigned to accommodate and rebuilt to accommodate the traffic of Embarcadero and Churchill. And so it supposedly had essentially less future traffic pressure, I'll call it, than Charleston and East Meadow, in addition to the fact that South Palo Alto has no grade separations.
And in addition to that, just to note that council had prioritized Charleston and Meadow. So they actually had taken that formal action to prioritize Charleston and Meadow before Churchill. So, but just noting again, I don't think that Churchill getting awarded final design funding necessarily means that it is any, or would necessarily be any further along towards construction than Charleston Meadow, because of course, once an LPA is selected, I feel like, and maybe even we'll get potentially funded now for Charleston Meadow for final design in the application we just submitted, which will hopefully not have to wait, 16 months or something to find out like we did. But I think that potentially just having the funding already there for the preliminary engineering and environmental phase will help us to show that we've made progress on Charleston Meadow and potentially make it more competitive for funding.
Ed?
Yeah, I was gonna like to add that we are focusing for more funding on Meadow and Charleston as we move forward. So we would hope that by the time the PE and environmental is complete, we have funding lined up for the construction, for the final design of Meadow and Charleston. So we are working hard to get the additional funding for that.
And then finally, to note again, once we get into this and we feel like we're in a place where we can apply for construction dollars, that's when we can really prioritize the projects based, and it's a lot easier to for the granting agency to look at something and say, okay, there's more traffic here, there's more this is why it's prioritized. It's very, it's just numbers to them.
The bottom line is we've got to get to the point of a local preferred alternative for Charleston East Meadow. Yeah, Ed?
Yeah, two things. One is going to be basically the second thing you just said, but I think Philip's right. We're not changing the message to the community. We're just changing the message of what we're going to get started on at this early phase because we have a grant, but we're trying to get grants for all of them. So there's no prediction that therefore Churchill is going to get built first, and we're still committed to doing all three of them. So it's just the way these, the kind of process of how the grants are falling into place that's potentially changing that timing, but may not change the construction timing. But the second thing is, and the ultimate irony is everything that Chair Burt said is absolutely true, that it's not as urgent anymore relative to the pandemic and so on. And yet it's more urgent for us to pick the alternatives. That's what I'm really hearing is the conundrum that we're trying to deal with here. And so if that's the case, then we just got to step up and advise our colleagues on how to do that.
Well, and part of that is that if the community is going to do grade separations, we are in a period of time where there are federal and state dollars that are unprecedented. Right. And I did want to revisit that. I've forgotten which acronym and bucket, the dollars that flowed through, federal dollars through MTC, for instance, that went to a couple of projects, including Mountain View. Which program was that? Because that's the big construction dollars, right?
I believe that's called BIL. I can't remember what is it?
Correct.
Build something. They call it Bill Grant, right?
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
And is that off of was the Federal Infrastructure Act?
Yeah. So my understanding is that all the FRA grant is also part of that bill, but we are competing solely separately as an independent agency rather than through MTC, because MTC has selected a list of projects based on the level of completion previously and some other factors where we were unsuccessful at that time. We did apply and ask for consideration, but Mountain View projects being ahead of our projects were at a higher concentration.
But that was the first of 5 years of funding at essentially that level, right?
Correct. And it is the same funding that we are competing with. So the FRA funding through a rail crossing elimination program is also part of that infrastructure bill that they have. But MTC is also separately as a package deal for the Bay Area proceeding which has a different competition than individually cities competing for the same fund. So the MPDES funding that we are funds that MPDG funds that we are asking for from infra and mega are also part of the same infrastructure bill.
But basically, to qualify for those construction dollars, we've got to be in the next 1 to 4 years, make ourselves qualified for construction dollars. We've got to be far enough along for those MTC allocations.
So yes, for any construction funding, they definitely like to make sure that we already have the environmental clearance, both NEPA and
my point is that those dollars will run out in 4 more years after this one.
Correct.
Without additional authorization.
Yeah.
And just noting that's the same thing as Ripon noted for the mega and the infra. Those funding programs are all from the same funding authorization.
Vicky?
Yeah, so we're in this unusual situation where we have this great news about getting these grants, and we may have an inability to use them in a way that is good in the long run and avoids the double whammy effect. Could you just play it out for me? If we were to decline them, is there any is there a whammy, like, wow, you asked, you put us through this and now we're unhappy with you? Or is there a, wow, that's an upright thing to do, and next time you ask, we know we've already approved you substantively and now you're ready? What's your best guess on the politics there?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that there's a formal punishment or a formal blacklist that occurs from that, but I do think that it doesn't necessarily look favorably upon us to do that. So I would just say, as having previously sat on the side that's awarding funds, I would say that that's not the best thing to do, is to apply, have them spend time, which they've already done, working with us on it, and then decline. But that said, it's a lot better than if we start trying to deliver the project and then we fail, and then we really look bad. We don't get a reimbursement, and then they take our funding and they have to reallocate it to another project later on. Okay. So yeah, there's different levels. I'd say it's definitely better to decline the funding right now and say we're not going to be ready, than to later be in the middle of it and not take the funding.
I see. That's very helpful. I was wondering if it were a wash, then why not go forward? But it sounds like it's the best case, we get it done. The second best case, we say no now. The worst case is we say no later, or we have to.
And Philip, is now the decision point on that? That's the other thing I wanted to just get better sense of.
So we don't exactly know the timing. This is kind of a little bit of a strange negotiation where they haven't given us real firm details on it. We've been just meeting with them and going back and forth and providing all the information that we can. And I mentioned that the April one is a little bit tentative, but we roughly think that that's the timeline that they'll be amenable to. So I think the reason that we're asking for direction today is we need to know whether we should proceed with a funding agreement with them, which potentially could be a little bit later than April. I mean, or I should say, if possible, we'll try and push it back, but also noting that if we push it back too far, then we have to say no to the other grant as well. So that's where they can be, or I shouldn't say we have to say no, but they might tell us, no, you can't push the other grant back that far. So there are potential repercussions there. But also within the first grant, for the preliminary engineering phase, there's a performance period where they will say your project has to be completed by X date. And that's part of the negotiation that we have going on with them. I guess if the question is, can we wait until October or after October, maybe 2025 to start, and know that we've gone through all these processes, we've done everything. I think that's really unlikely that they're going to be amenable to that. So just giving my candid opinion for where we're at.
So out of this meeting, this is kind of our first attempt to wrestle with these issues. Are we needing to give more guidance than just this discussion, or do we have ample opportunity to follow it up and digest this?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you have a sense for? So the reason I guess we're really trying to get some broad direction here in order to know whether we want to just tell them, like, what's the latest we can push it, like, and if that doesn't work within our schedule, do we need to decline the funding? I guess we want to know that. We need to know what to do about the additional studies. Should we proceed with them? Should we, work with our procurement to go out and procure a contract in order to get somebody to do all those additional studies? Because that's going to take time. On
the studies, if I might ask, weren't we going to go forward with those either way? And with Measure B dollars?
Yeah, well, the additional studies that were identified for the Measure B dollars were the existing additional studies that had been approved by council previously. That said, I'm sure that we can fund these additional studies out of Measure B dollars. It's just a totally different discussion. That these are just items that come up after the recent council updated, well, really from Rail Committee, but the update to the council criteria. So the answer is the criteria was updated, which could merit additional studies. So if so, we will need to move forward with procurement, which will put us in a queue with the city procurement in order to actually do that.
But before we got awarded these grants, weren't we planning on moving forward with those same studies, but having to use Measure B dollars, whereas now Measure B are matching dollars, and basically these grants make the Measure B dollars go further and our local dollars go further, and then make us more able to have funding for construction. Weren't we really going to go forward either way with those? Maybe does it change what we would be studying or the time frame that we would be doing it?
Yeah, it's the time frame.
We'd have to move forward faster.
Yes, I think that's the bottom line. Is we need to get it in order to get into preliminary engineering phase to start the actual funding from the grant. We'll need to do that earlier, and we need to finish that earlier. Then all these pieces fit together, would allow.
Can I just add one thing to that? I mean, this may be obvious, but some of these studies would normally be done in this next phase where we do like sea level rise evaluation, all those environmental studies, plus additional traffic studies. But I guess the council wanted to expedite those studies earlier on. So it's really a schedule thing where these are being done in advance of that.
Yeah, and so when we updated our criteria, there were certainly some important things, but it didn't feel like a least in my view, a wholesale rewriting of them. And so what I'm wondering is if we perhaps as a committee could take a look at those studies that might be holding this up and revisit simply whether we really need to do them before we make this decision. Because some of them are somewhat instinctive, like traffic, like given what Chair Burt just described. We still want to know the details when we get to the next phase, but we may be able to observe some significant changes from when we first undertook this without necessarily doing it before the decision. I don't know, it just seems like something we might want to look into a little more carefully that might give us some more flexibility.
And noting that we have done several studies already, like for traffic, we have done a significant amount of work. No other agency has done at this level of earlier phase, this kind of study. So I was looking at Redwood City's example of how, and they were actually learning from our studies and our cost estimates, and they have already eliminated the alternatives based on just understanding from the work that the Palo Alto has done. So, again, there could be some high level review rather than the detailed study. So that's the kind of effort that would be required of the study. The question comes up to is the execution of the agreement. Sometimes the amount of work that it requires to get the things done is less, but the processing of the agreement and the execution of the procurements and all that takes time. So we just want to see how that would all fit in this equation of the grant.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key, and that's kind of, as you asked me earlier for my recommendation is, potentially we could do light versions of some of these things, and maybe that's the path forward, is to do like a light version of some of these things. Maybe we as a group go through each one of the items and talk about how we can accomplish them, or maybe how they've somewhat been accomplished, what things are lacking, and maybe we can do that without the full-blown study. Maybe that's how we accomplish it. But
Ed?
Yeah, I was going to say, as I said sort of at the beginning, I just don't want to use this word, but the materiality of the changes that we made doesn't seem as severe as taking an extra year to do the studies. So I concur with Councilmember Vinker on that one. And I think that, particularly in light of your comment, we could do this in parallel. And even referencing back to the sea level rise, I mean, we know we have to look at that, but we don't think that that's going to sort of make it impossible to do that. Well, it could still, but we could find that out later and then have to make some change. I don't like turning down money because we need a lot of it.
Especially
right?
at the ends
so to stop now, I don't buy that.
Yeah, well,
we need to get moving here.
But here's the dilemma on that, and this is over the years as a city, we've seen times where we've had a grant start driving decisions, and that's not necessarily good. It's tempting, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do, and that's what we've got to actually struggle with.
But I think what Vicky and I are saying is let's do this in parallel at this point, and if we have to pull the plug later, we do.
Well, and that's what I was kind of trying to get at on what decisions today, because what is really changing, and we really got a better, as we kind of went through. Well, it's not what we will do; it's how quickly we'll do it, how high a priority, and so that's less of a dilemma than if it was whether we would do it.
Yeah. I take your point that a grant as a forcing function into an, not thoroughly analyzed decision is not a good thing. But I think in this instance, we have done a lot of analysis and we can do some more analysis. And our community is also impatient with, the lack of decision. And so I would say that let's let it be a forcing function on analyzing how we might be able to get there, and whether some of these things we've been discussing about, doing a light version of these evaluations, or maybe even there's one or two we don't need right now. I would lean toward let's try. Let's let this deadline push us to try to meet it, and then if we can't, we can make that decision, as long as we have the time. It sounds like we do, for at least perhaps one more conversation on this before you have to make the decision about accept or decline.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, it's still an ongoing discussion with the FRA. So I think there's probably time for us to come back one more time before anything, and noting that we need a grant eventually. At some point, we need a grant agreement to go to council. So that's really what we want. Your direction to tell us to keep going with at this. That we think we want to figure out how to make this work, or alternatively, let's skip on this opportunity and try to come back once we feel like we know better what our realistic timeline is.
My inclination is on the side of let's try to make this work.
Yeah, I agree. But I think you might be pinning yourself down too much with the comment that you just made. So I'm going to try to help you on that. There's room for one more conversation, but then we still have to keep going because you don't even have a resource to do this yet. So by the time we had another conversation, you might have the consultant, but then they still have to do the work. So there's a lot of checkpoints going forward where we still have to do a no-go.
So we definitely, so are you talking about for the additional studies?
Yes.
We will definitely not have a consultant aboard for the next, unless we're amending an existing contract. Just to note that part of the reason for the length of the timeline, I know you mentioned, it's going to take us a year for that, is that it probably takes us 6 months to go through procurement, just being in the queue and everything like that.
Right. So we're not going to have any more information in the next meeting.
Well, no. So what we'll have more information on potentially is discussions that we have with the FRA program manager and about how we can, finalize and really know what the schedule is. Potentially what we could do is come back to the next rail committee meeting and talk about the additional studies and how we can maybe make that something that fits within this schedule.
Okay.
Or what items are, I guess really the question is what items within that, and what do we need and how can we accomplish it within the timeline?
I'm just saying to my colleagues that in 30 days, we're not going to have a lot more knowledge to say go, no go compared to what we have right now. So I think.
Well, I'll add something else though. As we've all recognized today, this is a really multifaceted decision. And okay, we got this information, this meeting. We aren't going to have really material difference in a month. So let's just make a decision. That's not how I want to do this. I feel this needs to have a lot more thought and hearings from some other people. We may not have significant new information, but I think that this needs us to think about this in depth because these are tough decisions that could have ramifications that we got to really think through.
And I do think that in the additional studies bucket, that it'll give staff time to lay out for us in a staff report what they are, roughly how long they take, how that fits with the updated criteria, all of that, so that we can look at it more carefully and discern in a discerning way and decide, that perhaps we don't need all of it. So I think another discussion on that's briefed and we can think about would be helpful.
Well, one other thing that we didn't touch on here in our whole sequencing and funding sources is for active transportation, bike and ped separations. We've tentatively said that those one or more of those sequentially might be the first sequence that we would do. And they have some funding sources that are different from all these great ones that we have out here for essentially vehicular ones. And so that's one thing I'd like to get a better handle on at our September meeting is looking at how that fits in and having something similar to what you've laid out here on those separate funding sources, which are smaller dollars, but the projects are less cost too. But my understanding is at certainly state and regional levels, there are some really significant dollars available that are separate from this.
Yeah, I can just say at a high level, actually, one of the things that to throw into this mix is not just the timeline adherence and all that for the grants, but also the staff, the level of work that will be involved in delivering these grants and the project. And even though Caltrain will take over at some point, just getting up to that point and us being the grantee and all that will be a lot of staff work. Also, on that same note, regarding the additional bike ped crossings, that currently is being looked at in our bike ped plan that we just kicked off. That's how council's directed us to move forward with that. We're currently hiring staff to work on that portion of the project because that is well outside of the capacity that Ripon has to work on these projects. But we've got a recruitment out. It actually closes on the 27th. So we're hiring for a position to work on that. So not sure that I can give you a real in-depth report about that.
But one of the things that we haven't seen is similar to what you did here on what are the potential funding sources, what are the grants that might be available there. And so whatever we know about that, if we could put that down on paper, and maybe it's not all inclusive, but as much as we know. And then just a reminder that even though it's part of the bike and ped master plan, which is just getting kicked off, this committee had last year and this year wanted to not wait until the completion of that in order to be able to really hopefully have that not lag behind these separations. And of course, it's all the Loma Verde vicinity crossing is in our current bike and ped master plan. And there was quite a bit of history on how that didn't get folded into the grade separations because it was looking at an NV cap and it didn't happen there. And it somewhat got orphaned, even though it was a super high priority. And the committee has said, no, we really want to make sure that we're moving that ball forward and not just saying we'll look at that when we complete a bike and ped master plan, which is
sorry, just to I don't mean to cut you off, but just to note that in the bike and ped transportation plan, and I know we're actually running way behind probably to get out of here early, but that is an expedited part of the project is to look at that. It's not waiting till the completion. It's doing data collection, which is really we don't want to make decisions without data and community input. So it's following those two early on phases in the bike ped plan.
Okay. On that note, have we beat this horse enough for this month?
I guess the only other question, probably the answer is no, but we'll just raise it. Is there anything we should do to try to start accelerating the alternatives now? The PLAs. LPAs.
Well, next steps.
LPAs. Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
It's the TLAs, right? It's the three-letter acronyms.
LPA.
So
next item,
in
some ways does.
Yeah. So that's right. And the next item is one of the items that was one of those things on that chart that will be one of the things that we need to check off. I think if I could provide what I'm kind of sensing is the potential next steps is we could come back with an item next month that gives some options for how we could potentially look at completing, I guess, a path forward to trying to complete the additional studies within that timeline to meet that April 1st deadline, but still noting that it will be a lot of work to meet that April 1st. I just want to be realistic that, to meet that April 1st deadline, it's going to be a lot of work. Tough little road ahead in order to do that. But I do think that, there's potential for us to, maybe leverage existing contracts and maybe to take work that we have existing and to expand upon it and do some of that stuff. And then potentially look where some of the pieces might fit into future studies. So I think that's potentially a path forward. And noting that there's nothing that is required today for us to say we're accepting the grant today and we're going to sign an agreement or anything like that. We're just really looking for direction to keep working on this at this point.
Well, I neglected to check if we had public comments, and but hopefully the public will have benefited from this discussion and will then benefit from their comments for next meeting. Do we have any public comments?
Yes, Chair, we do. All right, our first speaker is Elizabeth Alexis.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, congratulations to staff on all the new funding. It's a great problem that we have today, that we have to choose whether we want to accept it or how to make it happen, but it's better to have it in the hands. I do want to just remind everybody, I know we're in such a hurry, but it is a 100-year project. And we look at the grade separations we have today, these were designed 100 years ago. They are still what sort of guides and drives traffic in Palo Alto. I was at University Avenue the other night and just thinking to myself, like, my God, don't you wish they'd spent a little more time to figure this thing out? So anyway, I know we feel like we're in a hurry there. I do not feel like our alternatives, despite all the work we put in them, I think they're still not at the point which you're going to get the community, even the ones where we say we've chosen. Like, I don't think, for example, we've looked at the sort of improve Embarcadero to the extent that it would be something that could actually compete with Churchill. I think the underpasses are really not there. So I would just really encourage you to start on that procurement for the new engineering consultants who would work on that. I think that has to happen as soon as possible. I did send to the council Burlingame's latest presentation. For one thing, they have chosen to take advantage of exemptions and exceptions for having to do EIR for CEQA and for NEPA for grade SEPs. And is that something that would give us more flexibility, especially since it looks like staff is pushing all these grade separations under Connecting Palo Alto, a general program, which might give more flexibility when we go back to negotiate these things, including perhaps getting these bicycle underpasses as part of that. I did have a quick question. I didn't really hear anything about the Caltrain grade set process. How is that going? Because those are also things which could help us speed up or change some of these alternatives based upon their ability to be flexible with their criteria. Yeah, just again, these are 100-year projects, and the current way we do things up and down the corridor is just to push forward, not get out of line. You've started it, don't change your mind. And I would just say, like, we're looking at some of the projects that are done, and people have regrets already, and I think we should get this thing right, especially in Palo Alto, where biking and PED is so important and the details of those things really matter. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Adrian Brandt.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Chair Burt spoke a lot about safety and incidents on the line. And I just wanted to, point out that it's important to be clear-eyed about the reasons for doing grade SEPs. And we need to really understand that Caltrain it happily does not have a safety problem so much as it has a suicide problem. The ex-COO of Caltrain confirmed the other day, he had responded in his career at the agency to over 100 fatalities, and all but a tiny handful were suicides. And that's something that we see today. Until just recently, there were only 2 deaths on the line. And just yesterday at Belmont was the 9th. So we've had a cluster all of a sudden. Maybe it's the summer. But in the United States, only about 1% of people commit suicide by train. It's actually less. Other countries, it's much higher. And also on systems that are fully grade separated, such as Parc, all around the world that are fully grade separated have comparable or higher suicide rates, so pedestrian deaths. So it's important to remember that on Caltrain, most of the deaths by far, like easily approaching the high 90 percentile, are intentional, which means they have nothing to do with safety. Suicides can and already do shift to other locations when there aren't grade crossings available. The last 4 that I can think of, the one yesterday in Belmont, nowhere near a grade separation. The one before that, nowhere near a grade crossing. And today, only minutes ago, while I was waiting in the queue, someone was hit at 22nd Street. It appears they may have survived, but again, nowhere near a grade crossing. It's a station. So we need to be very clear-eyed about how safety intersects with incidents. And the way it does is people that are violating the vehicle code, sitting in their vehicles across the tracks in violation of the vehicle code, or doing other things like mistakenly driving onto the tracks at night. Both of those problems will be resolved by grade SEPs, but none of those pedestrian fatalities that unfortunately Caltrain suffers would be cleared up by grade SEPs. People for a long time have already been unfortunately committing suicide from other locations all up and down the line. And so that's just important to remember. The other point I wanted to just briefly remark on was that I think it was said South Palo Alto has no grade separations. To my mind, Oregon Expressway in San Antonio both serve as functionally, I know San Antonio is in Mountain View, but functionally do serve trips going across the tracks and to and from, you know, the western part of Palo Alto to other parts. And so, you know, I don't think that's so much of a distinction between north and south. Thanks.
All right, our next speaker is Laura Granca.
All right, hi. Again, congratulations on the grants. That's great. And thanks for all of the hard and thoughtful work regarding them. I just wanted to add a couple of comments, some to echo Chair Councilmember Lowing and Vicky Incure about not necessarily pausing or declining the funds immediately, even if some of this may be out of sequence. I think it is going to be advantageous to all of the communities to have the grade separation, whether it's for crossing safety for students. I know some of this may contradict what Adrian Brent was saying in terms of safety, but both of all of the crossings being considered here are unique in Palo Alto in that the sheer number of students crossing these at a regular basis. And living near the Churchill crossing, just seeing the number of high school students on bikes and walking is pretty amazing to see in the morning, just in terms of how they're overflowing across the tracks into the roadways whenever there's an oncoming train or need to wait for the crosswalk. So I do think there's other safety considerations that grade separation would allow, irrespective of the suicides on the crossing. And again, twice recently, the Churchill crossing has been closed due to suicide at that crossing, which is also, you know, fairly disturbing for the community as well. So I do think it's important to continue to move forward, whether or not it actually is something that, yeah, obviously it can happen after the South Palo Alto crossings, but I would hesitate for us to decline or push it out just in terms of who's using this crossing on a regular basis and some of the more recent incidents there. Yeah, and then the other thought was maybe I believe there are going to be additional quiet zone studies along the corridor, which could potentially further improve safety. I also believe even in Churchill, there are some additional safety improvements in the works that are being planned, but so maybe just consider that for as some of the safety improvements that are going on, and maybe that's an option for us in the interim state, given this is going to be a long process to get grade separation. But thank you.
Our next speaker is Steve Rosenblum.
Good afternoon, members of the Rail Committee. I really appreciate the depth of the discussion that you went into on these important issues. And what I wanted to do is reemphasize the point that Elizabeth Alexis made, that this is a decision that you're making about this, the shape of Palo Alto for the next 100 years. And each crossing is going to cost, in construction costs, of the order of $200 to $400 million. So we don't want to let the tail wag the dog. You know, it's fine that we have this money available to start doing something, but on the other hand, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I think, to me, that's much more important than just charging ahead. And I think, as Councilmember Vinker pointed out in her discussion, there is a penalty for starting out with the funding and then deciding that the project is not going correctly, and to have to give the money back and to pay off all the expenses and start over. So I just like to say again that I appreciate all the thought that's gone into trying to hang on to these grants, which are really nice to have. On the other hand, to me, it's much more important that we spend the money correctly when construction starts, and that we think about all the issues that have been brought up that will lead to the best Palo Alto that will exist for the next 100 years, and not one that's divided by train tracks. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our public comments on this, and it looks like we're going to continue this discussion at our next meeting after we've been able to digest some of the complexity of this. All right.
Oh, so, excuse me. Did staff have a proposed motion they need for today? Just to close this up.
Yeah, just I guess we don't need you to tell us to approve the grant today, but if you want us to continue working on it, I think that's essentially what we're asking for today, is just direction to continue working on the grant at this point. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're necessarily saying we want you to move forward with doing the grant agreement, but just to continue working on it at least. I think
so. You want that as
direction? Yeah, I think so. Based on what's written in the recommendation for the staff report, does that?
And sounds like you'd like to continue this discussion at a future meeting. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe just those two things: direct staff to continue working on this as discussed in your discussion, and to come back at a future meeting to continue this item.
Okay. I would say that even without a motion, both those things would be happening, but I'm fine with that. So we'll go ahead and I'll move that we support staff to continue to work on the funding agreements, and that we continue discussion of this item to the September meeting.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. That passes unanimously. All right. That moves us now to our final item, which is Rail Committee review of preliminary geotechnical feasibility study memorandum prepared by the consultant for grade separations at Churchill, East Meadow, and Charleston. Welcome.
Great.
Sorry, so just this presentation will be provided by Peter DeStefano of AECOM.
Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Rail Committee members. Yeah, I'm going to summarize the memo that was included in the packet. I do have our senior geotechnical engineer, Paul Bodie, who wrote the memo. He can answer any technical questions for you afterwards if you have them. I also had Paul Nicholas, our tunnel construction methods expert. He actually had to drop off the call. So if there's any questions about some of the construction methods for the trenchless methods that we'll talk about here in the next few slides, I could follow up with him if needed. So let's dive right in. So in April, next slide, first slide. Exploratory borings were taken or drilled to depths of about almost 100 feet at each of the 3 sites, and soil samples were collected. The testing revealed that the soil properties were generally favorable for the proposed structures. So good soil out there at the sites. There is some liquefaction potential at Meadow and Charleston. And the groundwater at the south end of the city is a little shallower or closer to the surface than at Churchill, about a 20-foot difference relative to the, let's say, top of rail. So what this essentially means is that groundwater is expected to be encountered during construction at Meadow and Charleston, but not at Churchill. Next slide. So to summarize some of the findings, the temporary and permanent groundwater control will be required at Meadow and Charleston. There are a few ways to dewater the excavation area, and one common method is to install what we call a cutoff wall around the perimeter of the excavation area. However, the groundwater pumping will still be required during the construction because the excavation area will not be completely watertight. In terms of construction methods, all are feasible from a geotechnical standpoint, such as an open cut excavation and box jacking that we have discussed and what we have seen for the Long Island Railroad in New York. There's other tunneling methods that we'll talk about here in the next few slides. Yes, thank you. So this first trenchless method is called what we call a pipe arch method. This technique was developed about 30 years ago, and they use 24 to 30-inch diameter steel pipes that are horizontally drilled below the ground without disruption to the tracks above. This essentially creates like an underground support system that allows for excavation and placement of a permanent structure underneath live tracks. Next slide. Another similar method is called SEM. This is the sequential excavation method. This is similar to the pipe arch method, except instead of steel pipes drilled underground, soil nails can be placed with grouting placed below the tracks and above the excavation to strengthen the soil. It essentially create almost like a hardened shell just underneath the tracks to allow for excavation to take place, again, underneath an active rail line. That's really the whole gist of it, is to do it while the tracks remain in place. Next slide. This picture here on the upper right, that's kind of, that's like a cross section looking down the tracks. So the tracks are just above and we're tunneling underneath the tracks. And as you can see here, the excavation is completed in incremental steps and additional structural support is placed as the excavation progresses. Okay, next slide. So let's quickly go over some of the pros and cons for each of these methods that we talked about. The traditional advantage of a traditional open cut excavation is that there's minimal disruption to Caltrain service to transition from the existing tracks to a temporary shoe fly track. The disadvantages is that there's some throwaway costs associated with that temporary electrified track. In addition, the shoe fly track will require the removal of many trees between the tracks and Alma. For the box jacking, again, that was similar to what was used, or which was used on the LIRR in New York. The advantages is that shoe fly tracks can be eliminated. The disadvantage is that there would be a longer outage of Caltrain service to remove the overhead wires for the electrification to accommodate the excavators to perform that open cut excavation. And then there's time needed to reinstall and test the electrified system after the structure is in place. A 2-week outage is shown here on the slide. That's a conservative estimate based on the need to remove and reinstall an entire run of a line. I was talking to our OCS expert about this week. He said that run can vary, but it's typically between 2,000 and 5,000 feet. So we're not talking about just removing from pole to pole a couple hundred feet. We're talking about a couple thousand feet. Now, however, he did say that the overall outage time could be reduced if Caltrain allowed for a cut and splice of the wires. That is feasible. That could be done. He said the drawback to that is that it creates a structural weak point in the system. So, for example, if Caltrain just installed these wires, they're going to be less willing to have us come and snip those lines. However, if this is 20 years down the road or whatever, you know, maybe that is feasible. So that's something we'd have to discuss with Caltrain. For the pipe arch and the SEM method, the advantage is that these methods, again, can be done without the need for shoe fly tracks. And there's really little to no disruption of Caltrain service because the tracks don't get touched. We just tunnel underneath the tracks and the overhead wires. Now, the drawback is that these methods are most likely more expensive than the box jacking method, and probably potentially more expensive than the traditional method because the road profile would have to be a few feet lower. How much lower? I think we would estimate between like 3 to 5 feet. In addition, the cost for the soil nail ground improvements or the underground steel pipe support system that you saw on that earlier slide, I mean, these costs are very significant. For example, the pipes roughly each pipe costs about $2,500 per foot. Did some rough we actually did a calculation for a project in Menlo Park. It ran us $4 million for a larger excavation area, such as what we have here in Palo Alto. We're probably looking at costs that approach $10 million just for those pipes alone, just to prepare for the excavation. That's the cost of not impacting the Caltrain tracks. And then the last slide I have here. So yeah, recommendations for next steps are to perform additional geotechnical explorations during final design to confirm the consistency of the soil layers, confirm the design parameters for the retaining walls and bridge foundations, and lastly, to evaluate cutoff wall, groundwater cutoff wall requirements. So if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Yeah, or we could go to the public at this time. Sorry. Yeah.
While you're thinking about it.
Yeah, and let them help us think.
Chair, we do have one request to speak. Just one moment, or a couple. All right, Elizabeth Alexis, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, Council, again. So first, this seemed like generally pretty good news about soil competency. I do think, while some of this stuff can be kicked down the road, some additional studies, there are a couple of questions that I would have. One is, what's the depth of the water table during the fall, during the dry season at Meadow in Charleston? Does that help us in any way with construction? The second thing is, I do think we need some more information about the water table up and down the corridor, especially as well as some information about the underwater flows where we have underwater creeks up and down the peninsula. I am wondering, do we have more data on this from some work we've done for the city for our general plan, or does the water district have anything? I feel like that's one piece we're missing, especially for the alternatives that would have extensive north-south components, and that includes both trenches and aerials where the supports are going to be underwater. I am a little concerned maybe about the liquefaction possibilities in South Palo Alto, and I think it would be good to see that, especially since there's nothing to attach to down below the surface. Yeah, this is exciting. It's good news to hear that the Jack Box is something that looks feasible, and I think we could get some, I know that Long Island Railroad, which is electrified, did it over a weekend, so maybe that would be possible. Just the other thing is just as much other existing data that we can find. We saw that there was some stuff pulled in, but in the police building, it seemed like it stopped in 2008. Has it just not been added in additional projects with water table depth, just to understand the variance and the variability, and by season, by year, by location? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Steve Rosenblum.
Yeah, hi, Rail Committee members and staff. This is Steve Rosenblum, Palo Alto. Again, the short summary given by the consultant doesn't do the report justice. There was so much detail in there, and as a layperson, it took me several hours of study to understand what was involved with the cone penetration test and the borings. But I'd like to make some comments, which I don't know how relevant they are, but first of all three sites are in the 500-year flood zone. And as Councilmember Burt mentioned, we're in the area of climate change now. And we don't know if those old flood zone predictions are correct, will be correct, in 100 years from now. So we need to really try and do a little bit of future predicting about that. And the other thing is about the water table issue that also was mentioned by Councilmember Burt. Although it looks like Churchill is above, the water table is 32 feet below ground surface based on the one boring, the partial underpass will go down to 20 feet below ground surface. So it's within about 12 feet. And I noticed also that in borings that were done in neighboring sites at 120 Seal in September 2005, the groundwater level was 24.5 feet, and 2115 Parc was measured at 17 to 17.5 feet in June 2006. So I think Alexis's comment about measuring groundwater levels at different times of the year and more locations would give a better picture of the groundwater issue before we jump to conclusions on that. For both of these two issues, I think the viaduct offers a very clean solution since it's above ground level and it would not be subjected even to, predicted sea level rises of the 2100. So I think that's something, since we're talking about a project that's going to last 100 years, we need to put that into the equation. With regard to liquefaction risk, the liquefaction risk was quoted based on one set of data, but in figure 5 in the report, the MTC ABAG report puts all 3 sites in the moderate liquefaction zone. So I think we need to think about earthquake, we need to think about flood risk. This is not something we can ignore since this project is for a century and not for a decade. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Adrian Brandt.
Yes, thank you again. I must confess I did not pour through the full report as Mr. Rosenblum advised us he just did, but it strikes me that the need for a shoe fly on the open trench type alternatives just covered in the summary, it seems like an alternate approach would be to install a track crossover on either side of the construction site such that Caltrain could single track while first one track is taken out of service, excavated underneath, and the remaining track is untouched. So a full schedule could easily be run with just a little bit of care across a very short single track section. And when that first track taken out of service is completely ready to be rebuilt and have its wire reinstalled, the catenary, then the single tracking could shift to that track, and the second track could then be taken out of service. In other words, if it was done sequentially in that way and staged, it seems like the need for a shoe fly, at least a full shoe fly of the traditional nature, could and should be avoidable. So it would be interesting if the consultant from AECOM could touch on that if it wasn't already detailed in the full report. And I also concur with Mr. Rosenblum. The obvious way around all of this difficulty is what I feel is a superior alternative anyway. It's clearly maybe more costly, but you get more for it, and that is the viaduct. So once again, I think the viaduct solves a lot of problems that we've seen with all the other alternatives. Thank you.
All right, thank you to everyone. Now let's come back to the committee. Ed, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to ask sort of an overall arching question to you of what eureka moments, if any, did you find in this analysis? For example, starting with, it seems like you're not recommending that any particular approach at any of the crossings should be ruled out automatically based on these preliminary studies, but that and other things?
Right. I think there were no eureka moments for me, but I think I'd defer that question to our geotech expert. Could we get Paul Bodie? Is he a member?
I'm present. Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the groundwater issue. It seems to be.
Paul, can you speak up? We're having trouble hearing a number of the audience members, so just shout at us.
Okay. I'll speak to the groundwater issue, as the first item. I reviewed a number of reports that were provided by the city that had borings that measured groundwater. Some of them were north of Churchill, maybe a quarter of a mile, half a mile. I can't remember exact detail, but what we encountered in the exploration at Churchill seemed to be consistent with those and other experience that I've had in Palo Alto, kind of in that general vicinity. They also align with what the Santa Clara Valley Water District has shown on their depth to first water maps. They've since updated those. The ones that I referred to, I think, went back to like 2008. I've got to dig into the more recent information, but they definitely show that further to the north toward Embarcadero and in the Churchill area, the groundwater tends to be deeper. And as you move south, it gets shallower. And I suspect some of that may be due to proximity to Adobe Creek, Matadero, those local creeks. So it is something that should be studied in more detail. What we typically like to do is drill multiple borings, install observation wells, and then measure whether there are fluctuations. But based on the data that we have to date, it appears that it's deeper at Churchill and shallower down at Meadow and Charleston Road.
But you're not saying that something should then be ruled out on Meadow and Charleston, correct?
No, I wouldn't. Overall, I think the conditions are favorable. I mean, there are layers of granular material that could be water bearing. In fact, when we were drilling our borings and advancing the CPTs at Meadow and Charleston, typically we saw that we initially hit water at maybe 14 feet, something like that. And then by the time we finished the exploration, it had come up. And the way we drill our borings is we start out with an auger. So at Charleston and Meadow, we typically would take those down to maybe 15, maximum 20 feet before we start setting casing to convert to our rotary wash drilling. And with rotary wash, you use a fluid. So once you introduce the fluid, you can't measure a groundwater level. But you can't keep the hole open unless you have the fluid. So that's the way we stabilize the hole. At Meadow and Charleston, those water levels were encountered when we were drilling with the hollow stem auger. At Churchill, we drilled down to maybe 20 feet, encountered no water, switched to rotary wash. But then when we pushed the cone penetrometer and did what we call a pressure meter, a water level kind of measurement, or pore pressure measurement, it aligned with the data that we had from other nearby borings. Specifically, the data suggested that groundwater was at 32 feet there, whereas when you moved a little further north up along Alma, it was at maybe 33 to 36 feet. So that's not to say it couldn't be shallower, but based on the data that we have to date, it appeared to align pretty closely with historical levels.
Paul, this is Pat. I had one question that I'm not sure if I missed in the report. So one of the alternatives that's still on the table for Meadowston and Charleston is the trench. And so when we look at the water table impacts of an underpass, that's essentially going parallel with the water flow of the underground seepage. If we have a trench, then we're perpendicular to it. Did your studies indicate how much of a problem there would be trenching versus the other options where we're talking about underpasses of different construction methods?
No, not specifically. And I understand what you're saying. You expect the water to be flowing downslope, toward the bay, and you've got a trench that's going to present kind of a barrier to that. Is that correct? What you're alluding
to? It's a difference kind of between an underground obstruction running parallel versus a dam.
Yeah. The same question was raised for the Parc to San Jose project, because having the Bark tunnel run perpendicular to the flow of water, going from up gradient toward the bay, posed the same issue. And I think the consultant on that project came to the conclusion that that would not be a problem. And I'm not a groundwater hydrologist, so I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I would not see that as a potential issue. I think the water would find its way through, whatever permeable layer is down at a depth below the invert of the trench. And what Peter and I were looking at was something that might be on the order of about 30 or 35 feet maximum. And I would think that the water would come up to that barrier and would work its way down underneath into an aquifer, or a shallow groundwater or shallow granular layer. We don't know right now, because we only have a single exploration of how uniform that layer is. What we saw was kind of a layered alluvial profile that have clay at the top. You get to a granular layer that contains water. You get into another clay layer. Below that is another, not necessarily an aquifer, but certainly a granular deposit. So the uniformity or continuousness of those layers is something that would need to be studied with more explorations along the alignment of the potential trench.
So thanks. That's helpful. As I'm thinking through what you're saying, I can certainly envision that the water would eventually find its way to flow. But upstream of a trench, if you kind of put a dam there at a certain level, it would potentially raise the water level upstream of the trench. But then the water pressure would continue to eventually make it flow. But would it elevate the water level for the homes that are, we'll call it, on the west side of the trench? That's really one question. And second, how much would it exacerbate the construction difficulties and then the post-construction long-term pumping requirements if we have that shallow of a water table and at a trench?
Well, let me speak to the post-construction aspect first. If, for example, the area were dewatered, you would also have to have a permanent dewatering system to manage that water, because you're going to have buoyant uplift forces acting on the facility, and there could be leakage. Concrete, as you know, it cracks. Water tends to leak through, so you'd want to keep that water drawn down. So you could have a permanent dewatering system in place. If you had a permanent dewatering system, then you wouldn't see necessarily a groundwater rise. You could see a groundwater drawdown, and that, as I mentioned in the technical memorandum, could have an effect on local properties, utilities, railroad track, and that sort of thing in other areas, because you'd be potentially consolidating the soil by removing the water. If we went with the groundwater cutoff, which, as I cited one example in the technical memorandum, was done down south, in the rail corridor that runs between Long Beach and LA. They had a very similar condition. And basically you put in a cutoff walls around the perimeter of the area, and you put a slab across the bottom that prevents the water from coming up. Basically have to design for the buoyant uplift forces. And my understanding was that project worked out well, and they have not had issues. But that would be something that a groundwater hydrologist would need to be studied to address the question that you raised. Would this potentially impact and cause a mounding of groundwater on the upstream side of the box?
And I'll add, the permanent dewatering would probably be a significant issue in our community. We've really done a lot of work to try to reduce dewatering from construction, and this would be potentially a big dewatering if that was the case. And then the other thing that comes to mind is that We have Churchill that is showing a good water depth, but we also have this long time experience at the Oregon Expressway underpass, which has frequent failure of its pumping. Now that may be an engineering issue and an issue of backup, but nevertheless, it's surprising that if the water table is that deep, is that problem simply one of drainage into the underpass as opposed to other groundwater level issues at the Oregon location? And I'm not sure that you have answers to that, but I kind of want to put that out on the table to understand, okay, we've got a real 60-year experience at one location that's closer to Churchill than Meadow. And it's been a big problem, but there may be other explanations for that phenomena that wouldn't apply in this circumstance, but I think we got to dig into it.
Well, I do have some experience with that problem. My assistant, and this was many years ago, but I believe it was Hewlett-Packard, had a facility along Central Expressway, a little bit south of Oregon. And they had, in the building that they were renting, it wasn't the building that they owned, they had a groundwater rise that was affecting the basement level. They had a lot of computer equipment stored in there, and they called me and said, "Hey, can you come out? We're getting water down here. We're having to, remove the water on a regular basis. We want to understand what's going on." And the particular building had been designed based on a groundwater level that was much deeper at the time the design and construction was completed. And since then, the groundwater had come up, and there was no provision around the building for groundwater control. So as a result, they were getting water that was flowing into the basement. Our solution was to utilize the elevator shaft, which went a little bit deeper than the basement level, to serve as a location where we could sump, and pump the water out. So I think if you build those measures in, and this may be the case at Oregon, that at the time the studies were done, and I have not reviewed any of the information used in the original design, but if you were to go back and look at the water level at the time of that construction, it could have been deeper. And maybe it was not designed for a groundwater rise, and that is overwhelming the system that's there. That could be the possibility. I mean, we've seen that throughout the South Bay, where the groundwater is significantly higher in some places than it once was. And part of the reason for that is, our community. I mean, I'm not sure if Palo Alto would fall into this category or not, but historically there was a lot of agricultural pumping. Once that agricultural pumping stopped and the Santa Clara Valley Water District was recharging the groundwater table, you saw a significant rise in the groundwater level. And that is, troublesome to buildings that have basements that are not equipped, either designed to be watertight or have adequate subdrain systems.
Yeah, I appreciate that more broadly in the county. Actually, in Palo Alto, we never had a system where we were utilizing groundwater for our potable water supply, although there were a lot more private small agricultural wells historically. But unlike the rest of the county, we've actually been looking at this in recent years on what would be a sustainable pumping level, because we never depleted our groundwater level. But in any event, thank you very much. Vicki, did you have anything? Go right ahead.
I do, and I will keep it brief and accept a brief answer, because I know that there are other places some people need to be. But first, I do want to say that I really appreciated this report. I thought it was excellent. I make a living by translating technical information from inventors and engineers to judges and juries as a patent lawyer. And so I appreciate that this was very well done, because I'm the layperson here. And it was fun to read, honestly. It was well organized. I know that goes to both staff and AECOM, because you borrowed some of theirs. But anyway, thank you for that. So a couple of questions that go into the weeds a little bit, but looking at the recommendations for next step slide where we're asking about evaluating groundwater cutoff wall requirements to keep the pit dry during excavation. So I'm focusing more just on the construction phase here, and on pages 2 and 3, the Meadow Charleston, we're talking about the dewatering required. This is apropos of the conversation we just had. Because I assume there's differing costs associated with the differing styles or differing means of addressing this problem. There was on the top of page 3, it says, while soldier pile and timber lagging walls have the advantage of being relatively inexpensive and easy to install, they are permeable and would require dewatering. And so then it goes on and says, for that reason, we recommend cutoff walls. But in the description of soldier pile and lagging processes, there was also an option for concrete lagging instead of timber, which I assume would be less permeable. So is that an option? And would that also be cheaper than the cutoff walls? See, I did read your memo.
Well, even with concrete lagging, you want me to speak to that, Peter?
Yes, please do.
Okay, yeah. Even with concrete lagging, you're going to have gaps. So the way that soldier piles and lagging are installed is you do it top down. So you might excavate down 5 feet, then you begin to set lagging to support the upper part of the excavation, and then you go down another 5 feet, that sort of thing in steps. Traditionally, with deep basement excavations, for example, in downtown San Jose, they would use tiebacks, and tiebacks would be installed maybe at 10 feet below the ground surface because the soldier pile lagging system is relatively flexible, and you don't want the ground it's supporting to settle or deform too much into the excavation. So you need to provide some kind of additional lateral support.
So just in short, am I understanding it that it's not just the timber lagging that's permeable, the concrete lagging is permeable as well because of the seams in essence and the gaps between them?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, thank you very much. That's what I was curious about.
Okay.
And my second question has to do with the retaining walls and foundation support in the next section. And this is relative to Churchill. And talking about, in the instance where there might be these weak soil deposits encountered, that you could switch from the first process and put in the grade step walls with the cast and drilled hole piles. What I'm wondering is, can you change course midway? And is it more expensive to do the latter? Is there a reason you wouldn't start with the latter if you might have a problem with the former, which is the concrete cantilever walls? So I just, if you can just explain that to me a little bit more, because I'm wondering if that's those two are set forth as sort of alternatives, and it seems to me I'm curious if one can change course, or why one would start with one if there's an inherent problem.
I was basically just discussing options, and typically when you do a final design level study, you would come up with a specific recommendation. Now, that doesn't mean a contractor might not come back and say, in Caltrans terminology, what they call a CRIP, a cost reduction incentive proposal. They might say, no, we don't want to do that. We're going to switch to this other foundation system. But I think as designers, we would, recommend what we feel is the best option for the conditions. And that could be that, okay, we've done additional exploration and we've determined that there are weaker soils, and therefore you would want to support the retaining walls on cast and drill hole piles, for example. Or if the foundation materials we find are uniform and strong, we would say, hey, you can use a conventional retaining wall, cantilever retaining wall, and those are undoubtedly cheaper than having to go to the drilled shaft option. But both of those are, items or types of construction that could be considered.
And so that's kind of a game time decision, and you're just telling us that both alternatives are on the table. Is that the idea?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Actually, just to further elaborate on that, it's typically something where when we have more and more information as we progress through, that's something that will be identified during, or up to the final design before you're in construction. So it's not like you're there in the construction, you're starting with one and then you're like, oh, this isn't working, let's switch to this. It's typically identified through all the different studies and analyses that lead up to the final design.
Got it. Thank you. But at this point, you're just setting out the alternatives for us today. All right. Thanks so much. That's all I have.
I did want to follow up kind of the whole report to Ed's question about any ahas. And I don't know that I'd put it quite in an aha category, but what did seem to emerge is some real favorable aspects to the Jackbox. And that we need to engage with Caltrain to have a discussion on the couple issues that Peter identified. One is whether they'd allow that cut in the wiring, and also how long we can some refinement on, is it a 2-week shutdown or is there a way to refine that, which I think has been at other places the Jackbox has gone in, they've been able to do that more effectively. I also, and I don't think it was really within the scope of this phase of the study, but I'd be interested in any differentiations of the feasibility of Jackbox at East Meadow and Charleston versus Churchill because of the constrained space. How do you work a Jackbox in at Churchill, whereas you might have plenty of space at East Meadow and Charleston? And I'd love it if we could do it both places because I think there's a lot of advantages. I'm just not sure that we can. And then just where we talked about the differences in construction time, it would be helpful to kind of have some estimates on how much of a difference there is in the traditional open cut. Also, and Peter, when you were describing the different underpass methods, we use the term tunneling, and I just worry that people are going to construe that we're talking about tunneling tracks versus tunneling a road, and just maybe include clarifying language. Pardon me? Or the alternative that could be. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Anything else? We good on this report?
Just really quickly, you did remind me about this penultimate slide on the various construction methods, and per usual, like the one that seems the best is the most expensive, and thus perhaps not the best. That pipe arch is awfully compelling, although it seems quite expensive. Is it double? Is it order of magnitude? Do you have any sense roughly how much more expensive it would be?
So I ran some numbers. The shoe fly alone in today's dollars would be on the order of 15 to 20 million. So you got a savings right there off the bat. But you know, you don't have the full savings because then there's added costs. Like I said, for the pipe system itself, you know, we're probably talking about 10 million. You know, we'd have to run the numbers to see the true comparison of the two. We'd have to look at other things, like you said, Pat, about the available space. We'd have to look at utilities. There's a whole slew of things we'd have to look at to evaluate the total cost and compare the different methods. But I think to answer your question, though, I mean, I think we're probably looking in the ballpark that they're all, you know, roughly in the same ballpark in terms of cost. I don't think one is overwhelmingly less expensive than the others, except maybe the box jacking. And in fact, that's something I'm trying to get a number on, is the cost to set up those hydraulic jacks. I reached out to some folks in AECOM on the East Coast who are familiar with that project on the LIRR, trying to get some info on that for you. So until I get all the data, you know, it's hard for us to really say, but you know, that's probably not inexpensive either. I'm sure that's on the order of a few million. So
that's interesting if they're in roughly the same ballpark, because we don't have the removal of trees and shoe fly tracks. You know, with the traditional one, we don't have the cutting the new wires if Caltrain gets angry with us, or the, you know, the out of service with bus bridges. But obviously if there's not access for it, we can't do it at certain locales, but thank you.
Well, I'll add that what Peter was talking about is Long Island Railway, which used shoe fly as a preferred method. And my understanding is that it was done for reasons of significant less disruption and significantly less cost. Now we need to dig deeper into that, as Peter mentioned. And then when we talk about shoe fly tracks, not just the cost of it, we're talking about during the entire construction period, which could be a couple years of narrowing Alma to one lane each way direction. Pardon me?
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, so shoe fly has a very big disruption as well as the length of time of construction issue. But looking at these things really side by side with a deeper set of pros and cons, I think is where we really want to go next on that. But it's good to see that we now have Jackbox as looking feasible, and I guess the next step too would be to talk with Caltrain about it, and VTA as well, because VTA has used Jackbox construction for non-rail interchanges in the county, and I know from when I brought it up with the CEO there, she was going, "Oh yeah, we've used it. It's great." Now that doesn't answer all of our questions, but it's a pretty cool method. If anybody hasn't seen videos, maybe what would be good is we actually include a link to a couple of the videos that are online of Jackbox construction at different locations. They're time-lapse photography, and it's pretty cool to watch either way. I thought
you were going to say bring those to the meeting and we would do movies one time. Just like we did in grade school. Hey, it's a movie day.
All right. Anything else? So let's see. And we heard from the public on all this. So then there's a note here. It says study session. What is that about? On the agenda?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure. Do we need a motion on this item? This is an action item.
Just review. No.
Yeah, it does just say review. I think we're probably good with that. I mean,
I would, if you could indulge me, just to make a motion that you've received the report and direct staff to finalize it.
Is there a finalization that's going to?
So that way we can close this. Other than the cost numbers that we can bring forward to you, that which is separately, then we can close this.
Okay. Ask. Yeah.
All right. Good enough. Then I'll move that we accept the report and direct staff to or authorize staff to finalize it.
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That passes unanimously. Okay.
And then I'm seeing this study session thing noted here, although there's no information on it. I'm not sure. I think that's just an error.
Good. And then next meetings and agendas. So we have not only some of the follow-up that we've talked about, including some feedback from Caltrain, but Caltrain was attempting to get us an answer on the 4-track by around September, October. I don't know if it'll be September or October.
Yes, I think based on our more recent conversations, it sounds like it's going to be more in October range. Okay. Certainly not in time for us to have. I think our packet needs to go out in like a week or something. Or oh, I'm sorry, our packet for the next item is supposed to go out yesterday, so we're going to be scrambling here to get out the packet.
And our date for the next rail committee meeting is
19th. So we have a little bit less time. We've moved up our meeting now.
And I'd like to note that we are bringing the noise consultant. Noise and vibration consultant to the meeting next week. Great. So there will be a study session and you could ask questions because Rail Committee showed, expressed interest in, finding more about that study that was previously done in June or July 2020.
Yeah, and that could very well lead to some follow-up studies that need to be fill some gaps in that.
Yeah, actually, that'll probably fall in nicely to our discussion on the additional studies and what's needed to actually get to where we're trying to go in order to meet the grant deadlines.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything? No. On that note, we're adjourned.
Thank you.